Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on wherever you are and wherever you're watching this presentation. My name is Joseph Frankel, and I'll be your host for the next little bit on the microbiome in wound healing and regulation. Just a little bit of personal and professional background. So I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, sunny Melbourne, Australia sometimes. I'm a podiatrist, a wound care consultant, as well as a part-time academic. I have the honor of being the first Australian graduate from the Master of Science, Wound Healing and Tissue Repair at Cardiff University, where I'm also an honorary lecturer. My contributions in marking as well as reviewing some of the content, particularly as you get into the second year subject, management of chronic wounds. I had a little bit to do that. I also dabble in dermatology as well. So skin is my thing, and let's get right into it and let's talk a little bit more about it. So the microbiome, we'll go into actual definitions a little bit later, but really what we're trying to do today is we're trying to create a clinical picture to have a look at the entirety of skin and wound healing and the microbiome and just get some ideas in terms of how it impacts tissue repair and what future directions hold for understanding it, as well as managing it and possibly even leveraging it for improved wound healing outcomes. So in order to delve a little bit deeper into the microbiome, we first need to think about the skin and what it is. So a little bit of anatomy for you. Who doesn't love anatomy? Woohoo! The skin has its three-part structure. So we've got the hypodermis, which is the deepest layer, where it has the most fat, the dermis, which is the in-between layer, and the epidermis, which is the bit we see. So each has a unique structure, and therefore it has unique function, and they work together as one functional entity. So when we think about wound healing, we need to understand which tissues are affected or infected as well. And so by viewing that in its entirety, it will give us an opportunity to see how far things have gone and how we can repair things. So good old anatomical diagram for you. I think we all inherently know what the skin is. We deal with it. That's why we're doing our Masters of Wound Healing. And technically speaking, a wound becomes a wound when it breaches from the epidermis into the dermis. The epidermis is avascular. And so therefore, once we get into the dermis and we start to get the classic wound healing stages, then we can understand exactly where things are and how far they've gone and how deep they've gone. So if we think about those skin layers, we can also overlay that with the idea of skin barriers. So there's a number of functional properties of each of those barriers. And those barriers, in a similar sense to wound healing, having a number of overlapping stages and functions, the barriers also have overlapping functions. And essentially, it's another way of viewing how the skin behaves and what the skin is actually capable of. So if we look at this model that we've got here, we've got the epidermis and the dermis. The stratum corneum is the outer dead layer of the epidermis. But what you'll notice is right up the top, you'll see that microbiome barrier. So what is that? That's a number of commensal microbes, particularly bacteria, that have a functional role in protecting the skin and outcompeting other bacteria to regulate things. They're almost like the first line of defense, because that's the first thing that any potentially pathogenic microbe actually interacts with. It comes into contact with the commensals that are present on the skin. And if there's a breach in that, then the next layer of barrier function comes in, which is the chemical barrier, which contains antimicrobial peptides. And I want you to remember that, because antimicrobial peptides are important. If the commensal microbes haven't done their job, then the next layer down, antimicrobial peptides and their chemical properties will help prevent bacteria from getting down. So when we think about the microbiome, and we'll go into the definition shortly, we need to think about it in terms of competition. So if we've got a number of resident, normal skin flora that's sitting there doing its thing, if that functions in a protective way, then it's going to stop anything bad from getting through. If a microbe or microbes happen to break through those first two barriers, we've got a physical barrier, and the epidermis And ultimately, the dermis is quite tight in its junctions. And it's specifically designed that way to stop anything from breaking through the final barrier, which is the immune barrier. So if we get all the way through those barriers, then we activate the classical wound healing stages with the inflammatory stage, etc., and all of its subsequent stages. So hemostasis and inflammation, and then proliferation and remodeling, they all need to happen once we breach those barriers. So it's not just about skin changes, it's also about barrier functions. And so therefore that works both ways. It works both in a pathogenic way, but also in a regulatory and in a skin healing way. And so if we can view things in terms of not just assessment and not just breaches of those barriers, but we can also view things in terms of repair, that gives us a very different tissue insight. So it's not just about where is the wound? Is it in the hypodermis or the dermis or the epidermis? But which barriers are being compromised and affected in some way? So if we look at the function of each of those skin barriers, as we said before, the microbiome is that delicate balance between commensal, symbiotic, and potentially pathogenic microflora. It's a huge bit of science. There's a lot of research going on. It's quite exciting if you're a bit of a science nerd like myself. And so dysbiosis can be inherently, sorry, I'm about to sneeze, inherently pathological. Excuse me. Thank you. Hay fever season down in Melbourne. And when when dysbiosis occurs, that can exacerbate things, not just from a wound healing perspective, but also just from a general dermatological perspective. The chemical barrier, we know that skin is purposely acidic, as well as the antimicrobial peptides and natural moisturizing factors that are produced have a chemical component in it. And they also work with the bacteria that's actually present. We mentioned the physical barrier as well as the final immune barrier. So it's worthwhile having a think about that modeling, not just anatomically, but also functionally. We know that the outer skin in particular is quite tight, and it's like that purposely. It's like that purposely to stop things from getting through. And so when we're dealing with a wound, think about how that entirety of the tightness of tissue has been compromised. And then what's interesting is whenever we heal a wound, particularly a chronic wound and particularly a deep wound, we know that the restoration of those tight junctions doesn't quite come back. Wounded tissue doesn't behave the way it used to behave. So healing a wound isn't just about barrier restoration. It's also about restoration of that underlying function, that underlying feel to it. And this is where the interplay between micro and macro can sometimes get lost. If we think about things too much on a micro level, we're not actually getting a feel quite literally for the tissue. And we think about if we think about things too deeply on a macro level, we're not trying to leveraging all of the factors that go into what actually happens on a cellular level. So skin barriers are there for protection, and it's necessary in leveraging it physiologically is necessary in healing both dermatoses and in wound care. And so treatment is greater than, oh, well, let's knock out this specific microbe. And we'll talk about that later on when we talk about antimicrobial stewardship and things like that. But it's rather about addressing each area of barrier function. So the actual treatments themselves are really aimed at improving, replacing, or restoring those barriers. So skin treatment, wound management, it's really about helping the skin help itself. I mean, we have some incredibly advanced, technical, wonderful tools, dressings, all sorts of other gizmos that we're trying. It almost seems like every few months another breakthrough happens in wound healing, but really we're not trying to replicate the skin. The skin can heal itself. We just need to put it in the best position in order to achieve that. So if we look closer at the skin microbiome itself, we know that it's home to millions of bacteria, fungi, and viruses with a unique fingerprint for each individual and for each skin environment. So if you look at the skin broadly, there's moist, dry, and oily areas. And I'll show you a diagram on that in a moment. And so if we think about the environment, not just locally, but also generally, whether it's summer, winter, whether we're in a hot climate or a dry climate, we know that there's a number of factors that contribute to that microbial diversity. And there's horizontal microbial diversity. So in other words, interaction between different elements within, and vertical microbial diversity. So vertical means not just throughout each skin layer, you've got slightly different microbes, but also vertically, as in the genetic factors, as well as the transmission factors between intergenerations. So, I mean, giving birth to, when an individual is given birth to, that's a vertical transmission of microbial diversity. And so, yet another thing to perhaps blame your parents on. So if we think about the transmission of where we pick up our microbiome from, it's not just from other people that we live with and we're around in the environment, but it's also from mum and dad. Or, well, actually, most specifically, it's from mum. So when it comes to most of the wounds that we see, we mostly do see them around drier areas of the skin, whether it's around the ankles, the knees, the elbows, the sacrum. But think about the moisture interplay and what sort of bacteria, or rather what sort of microbes can contribute to that. If you think of a sacral wound, it's very close to a lot of moist and highly colonized areas all along the groin, in and around the anus. I mean, it's quite dirty. I say that in inverted commas, in the sense that not just because of obviously what comes out of it, but also in terms of the colonization that occurs as well. So it's worthwhile thinking about, what area. I mean, doesn't he look happy as an individual, because he's got quite a diverse skin microbiome, but each area of the body actually has a specific makeup of certain bacteria, fungi, and viruses that are evolved, if you will, and conditioned and targeted for those particular areas. Being a podiatrist, of course, I'm always very interested in feet. So you can see that Corynebacterium is really common in the feet, which gives feet its often its wonderful odor. But what's interesting, if you start to look at the fungal components, Trichophytum rubrin is almost found exclusively in the feet, compared to Malacesias, which dominate other areas of the body. So it's worthwhile noting that the microbiome changes depending on where you are, and that has an impact, not just on the skin condition, but specifically on the wound. So if we think about how we can classify the microorganisms that live within our skin microbiome, well, they can be grouped according to their relationship. So they're either called commensals, which are organisms that reside on our skin and they derive benefit from us, but we don't get any benefit from them. So it's somewhat of a selfish relationship. Symbionts have a symbiotic relationship, so it's a bit of a give and take. The microorganisms and the humans are mutually beneficial. And pathogens mean that the microorganism causes disease, but it doesn't actually benefit. So a pathogen is something that's bad. And occasionally what can happen is microorganisms become pathogenic because they're in the wrong place and in the wrong amount. So it's not, I mean, if you think about, Staphylococcus aureus, and I mean, that's generally speaking, it has somewhat of a commensal relationship with humans, and it sits there on the skin. But when there's too much of it, or when it's too deep, that's when it can cause all sorts of complications. So it gives you some insight into how we view infections within tissue. So the skin microbiome and disease, if we think about the most common skin conditions, which, by the way, do have a wound component to it. Dermatitis, acne, and psoriasis, rosacea as well. There's a wound component. Skin cancer, less so, depending on the type of cancer. But what we know is that the microbiome becomes dysbiotic. It changes in its function. It changes in its composition with all of these particular skin conditions. So it raises a few questions. And the first question is, which comes first? Is it the dysbiosis or the dermatosis? And the second question it raises, are many skin diseases essentially dysbiosis? So we're changing the way we look at things. I mean, if we think about dermatitis, for example, atopic dermatitis tends to be common in younger populations. And we know that there's an abundance of pathogenic flora. Staph aureus, like I mentioned before, becomes overexpressed and the amount of microbial diversity changes with certain skin conditions. And the same thing happens in wound healing. So that's where that overlap and that interplay, I just fuse those two words together, occurs when it comes to dermatology and wound healing, and how the two are connected with each other. So the shorter answer is, to those previous two questions, research. As many of you may have seen from some of the journal articles and textbooks that you're reading, perhaps even as well as the work you're producing, we still need to know more. So we know that dysbiosis predisposes skin to dermatoses and to wound healing by disrupting barrier function, thereby increasing inflammation or infection, as well as dermatoses themselves change the microbial function, which can in turn lead to dysbiosis. So it's somewhat of a continuum and an interplay between the two, as we mentioned before. But irrespective of the underlying cause, if we can gear our treatment towards modifying the relevant factors affecting the microbiome, we can improve things. So what are the factors that we're referring to? Well, we mentioned before, blame mum. So your birth type actually has something to do with it, particularly at a young age. So, and that's the difference between vaginal birth compared to cesarean birth. We know that there's something different. Age, what's interesting is our microbiome changes with age. Some of that also has to do with the way our skin works. We know that in older individuals, the dermis shrinks, which changes how much interplay there is between the dermis and the epidermis. We sweat less efficiently, and we know that older people older skin tends to dehydrate somewhat. That changes the colonies of the microbiome that exists. Genetics are a big part of it. Gender, there's a difference between men and women, depending on how much dry or moist areas we produce. Diet is critical. We'll look a little bit more about diet, because most of the time when it comes to microbiome, we think about the dietary impact and probiotics and prebiotics. And now there's more science on postbiotics that's coming out. The environment where we live, what our work is, whether we're active, what our activities are. So sweaty individuals, that can change their microbiome. Individuals that work in a very dry environment, that can change it. Your lifestyle, so things like smoking and sleep. We know lots of things that affect the microbiome. Hygiene and pets. Pets and animals can have somewhat of a protective function when it comes to maintaining good, healthy microbiome. So if you think about a diabetic foot ulcer and all of these factors that are impacting, they impact not just wound healing itself, but they impact things on a cellular microbiological level. So this is what we mentioned before when it comes to that interplay between the different areas of the microbiome. So it's a question of whether or not it's inside out or outside in. So the gut-skin axis, it's very much an emerging area of research. We're really seeing some incredible breakthroughs as to what can happen to our skin when we put something inside, but there is a two-way nature to it, and it can happen vice versa as well. And it makes light in the sense, it makes sense in light of, rather, reading my notes slightly out of order. It makes sense in light of the skin being an organ, and organs we know interact with other organs. So if something is happening in a vascular sense, in an endocrinological sense, in a gut sense, it's going to impact the skin. And so often when it comes to wound healing, we as wound healing practitioners are dealing with the consequence of all of the pathological dysregulation, dysfunction of all of the other areas of the body. If we think about a diabetic foot wound, for example, diabetes is an endocrinological, immunological, neurological, vascular issue. And so by the time we get to a diabetic foot ulcer, we, the wound clinician, are having to deal with the end stage of dysfunction of all of those areas. And so if we can have somewhat of a team approach, not just in terms of other health professionals that we work together with in managing ulceration and wound healing, but also a team approach in trying to understand how all of the aspects work together, we can hopefully leverage and improve not just wound healing outcomes, but also regulation outcomes for the restoration of skin barrier and prevention. So if we look at this broadly, we're looking at brain function, stress, anxiety, and in a healthy internal microbiome, microbiota of things that are happening inside, we get adequate nutrition, we get short chain fatty acids, we get enough vitamin D, and that creates an anti-inflammatory environment, which then translates into the bloodstream, which then regulates the skin. But if things change, if we get less vitamin D, if we put ourselves on SAD, the standard Australian, standard American diet, also known as the Western diet, there's a whole community of people worldwide that live off tea and toast, which is inadequate nutrition. I'm sure you'll cover that in later modules, but nutrition is a huge area when it comes to wound healing. So we're not getting enough of the short chain fatty acids, which are food for the commensals and symbiotic microbes inside the gut, arguably even outside on the skin as well. We're not getting enough vitamin D. And what happens is we get inflammation on a gut level, which impacts the skin, which leads to skin dysbiosis. And then we're much more likely to have dermatitis, wounds, acne, psoriasis, eczema, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just about fixing dysbiosis on the outside, it's also about fixing on the inside and fixing it both. And we'll talk a little bit more about pre versus probiotics at the end. So wound healing and barrier disruption, technically, as we mentioned before, a wound is an injury that affects the epidermis and then eventually the dermis. It can also be viewed as that barrier breach. And so therefore, when wounding occurs, there is a change to the microbiome. So what does that look like? It means that things are not where they're meant to be. And I'll show you another diagram shortly, which basically means that we're putting things in places that they're not designed to be put. So whether that's a pathogen, whether that's the antimicrobial peptides, whether that's skin and other debris and other components that aren't meant to be deeper in the skin, they're not meant to be there, and the body recognizes that. And so the having a diverse commensal microbiome actually upregulates and talks to the body and gives it the necessary information to heal a wound effectively. So what actually happens to the microbiome during wound healing? Well, there's an increased microbial diversity due to the lodgement of commensal microbes in deeper structures. So things aren't where they're meant to be, and that leads to problems. There's also an alteration in commensal microbial signaling. So pathogenic microbes disrupt tissue healing. They're sending the wrong messages. They're speaking the wrong language to the body. And so the body can't figure out what to do, which can also explain and also be the underlying chemical physiological cause of chronic wounds. There is a disconnect between the body's cellular interactions and the tissue repair mechanism. So everyone's decided to just speak a different language, or they start ignoring each other, which, by the way, is one really powerful reason why often one way to improve a chronic wound is to bring it back to an acute stage, to reboot that communication process. It's like putting things through a Google Translator. Everyone needs to start talking and speaking the same language. And ultimately, if we've got some disruption in microbial signaling, pathogenic microbes disrupt tissue healing, eventually it can lead to things like biofilms, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. I'm sure you've treated and seen, and therefore we get the presence of other pathogenic microbes. And it's really about a shift in things not functioning properly and not being where they're meant to be. So what does that look like? This is one particular example from this particular review, where if we look at normal wound healing, we see a normal behavior of cell patterns. They're talking to each other. Perforin 2, which is an antimicrobial peptide, which talks, if you will, in inverted commas, to different cells, telling the dermis to recruit the right cells to heal things properly. But if there's pathogenic bacteria there, if there's some sort of dysbiosis, perforin 2 is suppressed, and it doesn't do what it's meant to do. It doesn't have the hematopoietic function, which basically means it's not recruiting enough of the right, specifically red blood cells in this case, to do what it's meant to do. So think about that in terms of its signal molecule signaling. Signal molecule. Forgive me, it's quite late at night here, so my words start to get a little bit jumbled. And so therefore, it gives us some more insight into where things go wrong. So future directions, what can we do with all this information? Where's it going? What are we going to learn? How are we going to position our research? So there is some research that's found both oral and topical probiotics can be helpful in wound healing, but the results, as usual, are inconclusive, and we need a little bit more. We need a little bit more research. They're not quite definitive, but they certainly won't be. I shouldn't say they won't be harmful, but what we're really as we mentioned before, everyone's got their own microbial fingerprint rather. So everyone's got a unique microbial structure within their skin. So therefore, I think probably where the research is going is if we look at person A and they've got this particular makeup of skin microbes compared to person B, compared to person C, we'll be able to individually target our biotic therapy. There's also considerations. I didn't actually put a slide of this of postbiotics. So a probiotic is to actually put on a symbiotic or a commensal bacteria into a particular area, whether that's in the gut or on the skin. A prebiotic is the food for that particular biotic. A postbiotic is the chemical byproduct of the biotic. So essentially it's bacterial and fungal and viral poo. Well, viruses don't actually make poo, but you know what I mean. And so often those postbiotic chemicals and components can have a skin regulatory effect. We're starting to see it with atopic dermatitis and with a few other dermatoses. So it's quite exciting to see what we can do with not just the food, but also the waste, if you will, of bacteria. So antimicrobial considerations, you'll hear the term antimicrobial stewardship a lot throughout your studies. It's really becoming a key phrase. So we know the use of antibiotics in wound healing. It's an ongoing topic of research. It's something that we're really getting a much deeper insight to. So if we excessively prescribe antibiotics, so too broad spectrum or for too long or inappropriately, so we're treating uninfected wounds with antibiotics, that can have a significantly detrimental effect on wound healing from a microbial perspective. So we don't want to disrupt what the body's doing too much, because as we mentioned before, it's really about helping the body help itself. So it's about us putting it into the right position. So to summarize, it's a bit of a brief talk and we're just scratching the surface. And we can always revisit this and talk more about biofilms and signal moleculing, molecule signaling, apologies. And so we can start to look a little bit deeper. But to summarize, if we view wounds as dynamic tissue disruptions with barrier function alterations, we can get a more accurate diagnosis. We can get a more accurate management plan. So it's worthwhile thinking about those things. The microbiome is that first layer of defense for tissue injuries, and our commensal and symbiotic microbes help maintain tissue function and wound healing. So try your best wherever possible to restore that barrier and to get that first line of defense in place. And we can talk more about targeted therapies and management a little bit later on. Wound healing itself changes the microbiome. So have a think about and have a look into the research into it. It's fascinating. I'll put a few links in the final slide. And therefore, dysbiosis is a factor in chronic wounds, not unchronic wounds. So have a look into that research and the science behind it. It's really quite interesting. And speaking of research, in the future, assessing and leveraging the microbiome to aid in wound healing will continue to develop into exciting areas. So watch this space, and no doubt we'll keep you updated as best as we can. Here are some references for you, and thanks for your time, and good luck with all your studies, everyone.